London, in the spring of 1740, was a city consumed by treasure fever. In the smoke-filled coffee houses of the Strand, in the elegant drawing rooms of Mayfair, in the dank taverns along the Thames waterfront, the conversation was always the same: Spanish gold. The War of Jenkins' Ear, so named after a merchant captain who claimed Spanish coast guards had sliced off his ear, had erupted the previous year, and with it came dreams of unimaginable wealth. The Spanish treasure fleet, the flota, carried the riches of the New World back to Cadiz every year: silver from the mines of Potosi, gold from the streams of New Granada, emeralds from the mountains of what is now Colombia. These ships were floating fortunes, and King George II wanted them. More precisely, he wanted them captured, their holds emptied, and their contents deposited in the British Treasury, with, of course, a generous share going to the officers and men who did the capturing. Commodore George Anson was chosen to lead what would become one of the most ambitious naval expeditions of the 18th century. His mission: sail around Cape Horn into the Pacific Ocean, attack Spanish possessions along the coast of South America, disrupt their shipping, capture the Manila Galleon, the treasure ship that sailed annually from Acapulco to the Philippines, and return home victorious. It was a plan of breathtaking audacity. The Pacific was a Spanish lake, controlled from their strongholds in Chile, Peru, and New Spain. No British squadron had successfully operated there since the days of Francis Drake, more than a century and a half earlier. Anson's squadron consisted of 6 warships and 2 supply vessels. The flagship was HMS Centurion, a fourth-rate ship of the line with 60 guns. Supporting her were HMS Gloucester, 50 guns, HMS Severn, 50 guns, HMS Pearl, 40 guns, HMS Wager, 28 guns, and HMS Trial, a sloop with 8 guns. The supply ships Anna and Industry rounded out the fleet. On paper, it looked formidable. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The ships were undermanned and poorly supplied. Instead of experienced sailors, the Admiralty had pressed into service Chelsea pensioners, elderly veterans from the hospital for retired soldiers, many of whom hadn't seen a ship in decades, some of whom couldn't walk without assistance. Anson had requested 500 soldiers. He received 259 invalids, the oldest of whom was 70 years old. The average age was over 50. These were men who should have been sitting by fires telling stories to their grandchildren, not preparing to sail around the most dangerous cape in the world. Among the officers assigned to the expedition was Captain David Cheap, who would command HMS Wager. Cheap was a complex character, ambitious, brave, and utterly convinced of his own authority. He was in his early 40s, with the weathered face of a man who had spent his life at sea. His eyes, according to those who served under him, were penetrating and severe. He had served in the Royal Navy since he was a teenager, and worked his way up through the ranks through competence and connections. He was not a man who tolerated disobedience, and he had a volcanic temper when challenged. The Wager herself was a fourth-rate ship that had been converted from an East Indiaman, a merchant vessel pressed into naval service. She was 120 feet long, with a beam of 33 feet, and she displaced about 600 tons. She had been named after Sir Charles Wager, a former First Lord of the Admiralty. Like many converted merchantmen, she was never quite suited to military purposes. She was slow, she rolled heavily in rough seas, and her gun deck was cramped and poorly ventilated. But she would have to do. The Admiralty was scraping the bottom of the barrel to assemble this squadron. The crew of the Wager numbered about 250 when she departed England, a mix of pressed men, volunteers seeking prize money, and criminals who had chosen service over prison. Among them was John Bulkeley, the gunner, a meticulous man who kept a detailed journal of everything that happened. There was also Thomas Clark, the gunner's mate, who would prove to be one of the most resourceful men on the expedition. The carpenter was John Cummins, a skilled craftsman whose abilities would later prove crucial to survival. The surgeon was Henry Ettrick, overwhelmed and under-equipped for the medical catastrophe that awaited them. Also aboard was a young midshipman named John Byron, just 16 years old and already on his second naval voyage. Byron came from a distinguished family. His grandfather had been a baron, and young John had connections that would serve him well later in life. He was slight, with dark eyes and a quick mind, and he kept a journal that would later become one of the primary sources for what happened. Decades later, he would become an admiral and the grandfather of the poet Lord Byron. But in 1740, he was just a boy, terrified and excited in equal measure, with no idea of the horrors that awaited him. The squadron departed Portsmouth on September 18, 1740, 5 months later than originally planned. The delay would prove catastrophic. Instead of rounding Cape Horn during the South American summer, December to February, they would attempt it during the winter, May to June, when the storms were at their worst. Almost immediately, things went wrong. Barely out of the English Channel, the ships encountered severe gales that scattered the squadron. The elderly Chelsea pensioners began dying almost at once, from disease, from the shock of conditions aboard ship, from sheer despair. Their bodies were sewn into canvas shrouds and dropped over the side with minimal ceremony. By the time the squadron reached Madeira, dozens were already dead. From Madeira, they sailed to Brazil, reaching the island of Santa Catarina in late December. Here, they stopped to take on water and fresh provisions and to bury more of their dead. Scurvy was already appearing, the disease caused by lack of vitamin C that would become the greatest killer of the expedition. Men's gums became spongy and black, their teeth fell out, old wounds reopened, their legs swelled with fluid. The ship's surgeon could do nothing except offer laudanum for the pain and recommend fresh citrus fruits, which were rarely available. On January 18, 1741, the squadron departed Brazil and headed south toward Cape Horn. They were sailing into one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on Earth. The waters around Cape Horn, where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans meet, are notorious for violent storms that can arise with little warning. Waves regularly reach 60 feet or more, driven by winds that circle the globe unimpeded by any landmass. These are the screaming 60s, where westerly winds howl perpetually, and where the ocean itself seems to rage against the intrusion of human vessels. By March, they had reached the Falkland Islands, already far behind schedule and with their crews decimated by disease. They pressed on. On March 7th, they rounded the Le Maire Strait at the southern tip of Tierra del Fuego and entered the waters of Cape Horn. What followed was 2 months of pure hell. The storm struck almost immediately, massive systems that seemed to merge into one continuous tempest. The ships were hammered by winds that shredded sails and snapped masts like matchsticks. Waves crashed over the decks with the force of avalanches, sweeping away anything and anyone not secured. The temperature plummeted. Rain, sleet, and snow drove horizontally through the rigging. The ships lost sight of each other in the murk and struggled on independently. Below decks on the Wager, conditions were nightmarish. Water poured through every seam and hatchway, sloshing knee-deep through the gun deck and the berthing areas. The sick and dying lay in this frigid soup, unable to move to the pumps, unable even to care for themselves. The stench was overwhelming: unwashed bodies, vomit, excrement, and the sweet, sick smell of gangrene. Men were dying every day now, sometimes several in a single watch. Their bodies were stacked on deck until there was a break in the weather long enough to commit them to the deep. The crew was exhausted beyond anything they had experienced. 4 hours on watch, 4 hours off, except that the off watch was spent at the pumps,
constantly trying to keep the ship from foundering. They worked in freezing water, their hands so numb they couldn't feel the ropes they pulled. Frostbite was common. Men collapsed from exhaustion and had to be dragged below before they washed overboard. Captain Cheap drove them mercilessly. He knew that any slackening of effort would mean the ship's destruction. He was everywhere, on the quarterdeck in the worst weather, screaming orders over the wind, personally supervising the setting of storm sails, lashing out with his cane at any man who wasn't moving fast enough. He was trying to save the ship, but his methods were creating a reservoir of resentment that would later prove explosive. For 8 weeks the Wager battled westward, making agonizingly slow progress. Sometimes a full day of struggle gained them only a few miles. Other times they were driven backwards, losing ground despite their best efforts. The ship was being pounded to pieces. The caulking between the planks was working loose, and the pumps could barely keep up with the water pouring in. The rigging was a tangled mess of broken lines and torn canvas. The foremast was cracked and reinforced with spare timber lashed around it. They were sailing a wreck, and everyone knew it. On April 24th, disaster struck. Through a combination of navigational error and sheer bad luck, the Wager found herself being driven towards a lee shore, a coastline towards which the wind was blowing. In sailing parlance, this is one of the most dangerous situations possible, because it's nearly impossible to sail away from a lee shore in a storm. The land acts as a trap, drawing the ship inexorably towards destruction on the rocks. By Captain Cheap ordered everything done that could be done. They tried to claw their way offshore, but the wind was too strong and the ship too damaged. As darkness fell, they could hear the terrifying sound of breakers ahead, the distinctive roar of ocean waves smashing against rocks and shore. They anchored, hoping the anchors would hold until daylight, when they might be able to see what they were facing. The anchors didn't hold.
May 14th, 1741, a day that would be seared into the memory of every man who survived it. At approximately 4 a.m., the Wager struck a submerged rock with a grinding, shuddering impact that threw men from their hammocks and sent anything loose crashing across the decks. The ship lurched, stuck fast, then was lifted by another wave and driven further onto the rocks. Timbers screamed as they splintered. The hull was breached in multiple places, and the sea rushed in. Panic erupted. In the darkness and confusion, with the ship heeling over at a severe angle and water flooding the lower decks, men scrambled for the upper deck in safety. Some tried to reach the boats, others clung to whatever they could grab. The sick and injured, trapped below, screamed for help that mostly never came. Captain Cheap tried to maintain order, but it was hopeless. The ship was breaking up beneath them. With each wave, more timbers gave way. The foremast, already damaged, came crashing down in a tangle of rigging that trapped several men and swept others over the side into the boiling surf. Their screams were lost in the roar of the storm. As dawn broke, the survivors could see their situation. The Wager had been driven onto the rocks of a small, desolate island off the coast of Patagonia in what is now Chile. The island was barren, treeless, swept by constant wind and rain. There was no obvious source of fresh water, no sign of habitation, no indication that anything lived here except seabirds and seals. And they were alone. The rest of Anson's squadron was gone, scattered by the storms, pressing on to the Pacific if they had survived, or wrecked on other nameless shores if they hadn't. No rescue would be coming. They were on their own, at the edge of the known world. Over the next few days, they managed to get most of the surviving crew ashore, along with whatever supplies they could salvage from the wreck. The final count showed that they had started with about 250 souls aboard the Wager. Now they numbered 145. More than 100 men had died in the storms or in the wreck itself, drowned, crushed by falling spars, or trapped below decks when the hull broke open. The mood was grim.
They were soaked, freezing, and hungry. Many were sick or injured. They had limited supplies, some gunpowder and weapons, a few barrels of salt pork and ship's biscuit, some rum. The ship's carpenter estimated that the wager might hold together for a few more weeks at most before the sea finished breaking her apart. If they were going to salvage anything else, they needed to do it quickly. Captain Cheap assembled the men and addressed them. He was still in command, he declared, and they would maintain naval discipline. They would salvage what they could from the ship, establish a camp ashore, and build some kind of vessel to sail north to the Spanish settlements, where they would either capture a ship or surrender as prisoners of war. Either way, they would escape this God-forsaken place. This was an order from their captain, and they would obey. But something had changed. On a ship at sea, a captain's authority is absolute. It's backed by law, tradition, and the practical reality that survival depends on organized effort under single command. But they weren't on a ship anymore. They were castaways on a barren island, and the old certainties of naval discipline were starting to fray. Some of the men were already grumbling. Why should they follow Cheap's orders? The ship was wrecked. Didn't that mean his command had ended? And more to the point, was his plan even feasible? Building a vessel large enough to carry 145 men in this climate with the limited tools they had salvaged? It seemed impossible. There were other ideas circulating through the camp, other plans whispered around the fires at night. But for now, Cheap was still the captain, and most men were too exhausted and disoriented. May 14th, 1741, a day that would be seared into the memory of every man who survived it. At approximately 4 a.m., the wager struck a submerged rock with a grinding, shuddering impact that threw men from their hammocks and sent anything loose crashing across the decks. The ship lurched, stuck fast, then was lifted by another wave and driven further onto the rocks. Timbers screamed as they splintered. The hull was breached in multiple places, and the sea rushed in. Panic erupted. In the darkness and confusion, with the ship heeling over at a severe angle and water flooding the lower decks, men scrambled for the upper deck in safety. Some tried to reach the boats, others clung to whatever they could grab. The sick and injured, trapped below, screamed for help that mostly never came. Captain Cheap tried to maintain order, but it was hopeless. The ship was breaking up beneath them. With each wave, more timbers gave way. The foremast, already damaged, came crashing down in a tangle of rigging that trapped several men and swept others over the side into the boiling surf. Their screams were lost in the roar of the storm. As dawn broke, the survivors could see their situation. The wager had been driven onto the rocks of a small, desolate island off the coast of Patagonia in what is now Chile. The island was barren, treeless, swept by constant wind and rain. There was no obvious source of fresh water, no sign of habitation, no indication that anything lived here except seabirds and seals. And they were alone. The rest of Anson's squadron was gone, scattered by the storms, pressing on to the Pacific if they had survived, or wrecked on other nameless shores if they hadn't. No rescue would be coming. They were on their own, at the edge of the known world. Over the next few days, they managed to get most of the surviving crew ashore, along with whatever supplies they could salvage from the wreck. The final count showed that they had started with about 250 souls aboard the wager. Now they numbered 145. More than 100 men had died in the storms or in the wreck itself, drowned, crushed by falling spars, or trapped below decks when the hull broke open. The mood was grim. They were soaked, freezing, and hungry. Many were sick or injured. They had limited supplies, some gunpowder and weapons, a few barrels of salt pork and ship's biscuit, some rum. The ship's carpenter estimated that the wager might hold together for a few more weeks at most before the sea finished breaking her apart. If they were going to salvage anything else, they needed to do it quickly. Captain Cheap assembled the men and addressed them. He was still in command, he declared, and they would maintain naval discipline. They would salvage what they could from the ship, establish a camp ashore, and build some kind of vessel to sail north to the Spanish settlements, where they would either capture a ship or surrender as prisoners of war. Either way, they would escape this God-forsaken place. This was an order from their captain, and they would obey. But something had changed. On a ship at sea, a captain's authority is absolute. It's backed by law, tradition, and the practical reality that survival depends on organized effort under single command. But they weren't on a ship anymore. They were castaways on a barren island, and the old certainties of naval discipline were starting to fray. Some of the men were already grumbling. Why should they follow Cheap's orders? The ship was wrecked. Didn't that mean his command had ended? And more to the point, was his plan even feasible? Building a vessel large enough to carry 145 men in this climate with the limited tools they had salvaged? It seemed impossible. There were other ideas circulating through the camp, other plans whispered around the fires at night. But for now, Cheap was still the captain, and most men were too exhausted and disoriented to do anything but follow orders. They set about the grim work of survival. The debate over what to do next had been going on since they first landed, but it intensified after Cozen's death. Captain Cheap insisted on his original plan: build a vessel, sail north to the Spanish settlements in Chile, and surrender as prisoners of war. From there, they would eventually be repatriated to England, probably through a prisoner exchange. It might take years, but at least they would be alive and would eventually see home. A faction led by the gunner, John Bulkeley, and the gunner's mate, Thomas Clark, had a different idea. They argued that sailing north into Spanish territory was madness. They would be imprisoned, possibly for the rest of their lives, or even executed as pirates. Instead, they should sail south, retrace their route around Cape Horn, as impossible as that seemed, and try to reach Brazil or some other Portuguese or neutral territory. It would be an epic voyage, incredibly dangerous, but at least they would remain free Englishmen. The two sides argued bitterly. Cheap insisted that he was still the captain, and his orders must be obeyed. Bulkeley countered that the wreck of the Wager had dissolved Cheap's commission. He was no longer captain of a ship, because there was no ship. Therefore, they were all free men, and decisions should be made collectively. This was legal territory that had never been fully explored. What was the status of a crew when their ship was lost? Were they still subject to naval discipline? Did the captain retain his authority? There was no clear answer in the naval regulations or in legal precedent. It would later become a major point of contention at the courts-martial that followed. By mid-October 1741, 5 months after the wreck, the carpenter had finished building a modified longboat, which they named the Speedwell. It was about 40 feet long, with the sides built up to add more freeboard, and it could theoretically carry about 70 men in crowded conditions. They had also salvaged and repaired the Wager's cutter and a smaller boat. Between the 3 vessels, they could carry all the survivors, assuming they all agreed on where to go. But they didn't agree. The camp was openly split now. Cheap's faction, consisting mostly of officers and a handful of loyal sailors, numbered about 20 men. They would sail north as the captain ordered. Bulkeley's faction, numbering about 80 men, would sail south. The remaining few dozen men were undecided, torn between fear of defying their captain and the practical belief that Bulkeley's plan had a better chance of success. The crisis came to a head on night of October 9th, 1741. Bulkeley's group, fearing that Cheap would try to sabotage the Speedwell or forcibly take command of it, decided to act. They armed themselves and, in what was essentially a mutiny, placed Captain Cheap under arrest. They confined him to a crude shelter under guard, along with a few officers who remained loyal to him. The next morning, Bulkeley gathered the men and read aloud a document they had prepared. It was a formal statement declaring that David Cheap had been relieved of command due to his tyrannical behavior and the fact that his continued command endangered the lives of the men. Authority would now rest with a council of senior warrant officers, basically Bulkeley and his supporters. Anyone who wished to remain with Cheap was free to do so, but the Speedwell and the other boats would be sailing south, and anyone not aboard when they departed would be left behind. It was a carefully calculated move. By presenting it as a democratic decision made for the good of all, rather than as a mutiny, Bulkeley was hoping to provide legal cover for what they were doing. Whether it would hold up under scrutiny back in England was anyone's guess. Over the next few days, men made their choices. Most joined Bulkeley's group. A few remained loyal to Cheap, including the young midshipman John Byron. About a dozen men, too sick or injured to travel, or simply too despairing to care, said they would remain on the island, preferring to take their chances there rather than risk the sea voyage. On October 14, 1741, 6 months after the wreck, the Speedwell and the other boats departed Wager Island, carrying 81 men. They left behind Captain Cheap, 3 loyal officers, Midshipman Byron, the ship's surgeon, and about a dozen sailors. Also left behind the men too sick to sail, though in truth they were being abandoned to die. There was no way they could survive on the island without support. As the Speedwell disappeared into the channel, rowing south against the wind, Captain Cheap watched from the shore. His face, according to Byron, was a mask of fury and despair. He had lost his ship, lost his crew, and lost his authority. All that remained was his conviction that he was right, and those who had defied him were mutineers who would pay for their crime. What neither group knew yet was that both would end up back in England, and their conflicting accounts of what had happened would spark one of the most significant legal battles in the history of the Royal Navy.
The voyage of the Speedwell became one of the most remarkable small boat journeys in maritime history, though it is far less famous than the voyage of the Bounty's launch or Shackleton's journey from Elephant Island. 81 men crammed into 3 small boats, attempting to sail 3,000 miles through some of the worst waters on Earth, with minimal supplies and no margin for error. John Bulkeley, as the senior surviving warrant officer and the architect of their departure, was effectively the leader, though they maintained the fiction that decisions were made collectively. Thomas Clark, the gunner's mate, was his right-hand man. The carpenter, John Cummins, was indispensable. Any damage to the boats would require his skills to repair. They carried with them a few weeks' worth of food, some gunpowder and weapons, and navigational instruments salvaged from the Wager. The gunner had also managed to save his journal, in which he meticulously recorded their journey. The first part of the voyage took them through the Chilean archipelago, that endless maze of channels, islands, and passages. Navigation was a nightmare. The charts they had were poor, landmarks were few, and visibility was often measured in yards rather than miles. They frequently went ashore to search for water and food, sometimes encountering bands of indigenous people, the Kaweskar, who had lived in these channels for thousands of years, navigating the waters in bark canoes and surviving on fish and shellfish. The encounters with the Kaweskar were tense. The indigenous people were understandably suspicious of these strange foreigners. Sometimes they traded, offering fish or shellfish in exchange for bits of metal or cloth. Other times there were confrontations that nearly turned violent. The Kaweskar had suffered terribly from previous European contacts. Disease, enslavement, and violence had decimated their population. They had little reason to trust any outsiders. The boats struggled southward through November and into December. Men were dying from starvation, from disease, from exposure. The cold was relentless, and they were constantly wet. They would land on some rocky shore, try to start a fire with damp wood, eat whatever meager ration they had, and sleep huddled together for warmth. Then the next morning they would push off and continue. Some men began to despair. There were mutterings about turning back, about trying to reach the Spanish settlements after all. But Bulkeley drove them on. He knew that if they turned back now, they were finished. Their only hope was to keep going,
to believe that they could make it around the Horn and north to Brazil. By Christmas Day, 1741, they had reached the entrance to the Strait of Magellan. This narrow passage, discovered by Ferdinand Magellan in 1520, was the traditional route for ships going from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was an alternative to rounding Cape Horn, less stormy but navigationally treacherous, with complex tides and currents. They decided to attempt it. The passage through the strait took 2 weeks of brutal effort. They had to row against contrary currents, often making only a few miles a day. They ran out of food and were reduced to eating whatever they could find: seaweed, shellfish, even their leather shoes boiled to make a gelatinous soup. Men were dying every few days now. Each time they would pause briefly, commit the body to the sea with a few words, and move on. There was no time for proper ceremonies. On January 7th, 1742, the Speedwell emerged from the Strait of Magellan into the Atlantic Ocean. They had made it. Against all odds, they had successfully transited one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world, in open boats. But they were barely alive. Of the 81 men who had left Wager Island, only about 60 remained. The rest had died and been buried at sea. Now they faced a new challenge, sailing 2,000 miles north along the coast of Argentina to reach Brazil, and they were out of food.
The coast of Patagonia is one of the most desolate in the world. It stretches for hundreds of miles, a low, barren shore backed by arid plains, with few harbors, no settlements, and little vegetation. The Spanish Empire claimed it, but they had never bothered to establish colonies there. It was too remote, too harsh, and offered nothing of value. The Speedwell hugged this coast as they sailed north, desperately searching for food and water. Occasionally they would land and send out hunting parties, but there was little to hunt. They found some guanaco, a relative of the llama, but the animals were wary and hard to approach. They tried fishing, with limited success. Mostly, they were starving. The men began to exhibit the classic signs of advanced starvation. Their bodies consumed their own muscle tissue for energy. They became skeletal, their eyes sunken, their movements slow and mechanical. Some became delirious, hallucinating food or rescue. Others fell into a kind of stupor, lying in the bottom of the boat, barely conscious. Bulkeley and Clark tried to maintain order and keep up morale, but it was increasingly difficult. Some men accused the leaders of hoarding food for themselves, though there was no evidence of this. Others simply gave up, refusing to help row or work the sails, waiting passively for death. The question of cannibalism arose. It was the unspoken thought in everyone's mind. When a man died, why should his body go into the sea when it could sustain the living? This wasn't an abstract moral question. It was immediate and practical. Cannibalism had a long history at sea, often tacitly accepted when it was a matter of survival. There were even informal protocols, the lottery to determine who would be killed and eaten, the taboo against eating someone you knew well. According to Bulkeley's journal, they resisted this ultimate transgression, though he writes cryptically about measures we shall not here describe and things done which necessity alone could justify. Read between the lines, and it's likely that some cannibalism did occur, though the survivors were understandably reluctant to admit it. By late January 1742, they reached the Rio de la Plata, the enormous estuary between Argentina and Uruguay. They were close now. Brazil was just a few hundred miles north, but they were also at the absolute limit of human endurance. Men were dying daily. The boats were barely seaworthy, held together by jury-rigged repairs. On January 28, 1742, the Speedwell reached a Portuguese settlement at the southern tip of Brazil, Santa Catarina Island, the same place where Anson's squadron had stopped on the way out. Of the 81 men who had left Wager Island,
30 arrived alive. 51 had died during the 4-month voyage. The Portuguese received them with a mixture of compassion and suspicion. These skeletal, ragged scarecrows claimed to be British sailors from a wrecked warship, but they looked more like pirates or criminals. They were fed, given medical care, and housed while the Portuguese authorities decided what to do with them. Over the following months, Bulkeley and his men were gradually repatriated to England. They traveled by merchant ship via Portugal and finally arrived in London in early 1743. Bulkeley immediately set about writing his account of the voyage, which he published in 1743 under the title A Voyage to the South Seas. It was a sensation, a tale of shipwreck, survival, and mutiny that gripped the public imagination. But Bulkeley's narrative was only one side of the story, because, incredibly, Captain Cheap and his group had also survived, and they had a very different version of events.
When the Speedwell departed Wager Island in October 1741, Captain David Cheap was left behind with a small group of loyalists, 3 other officers, Midshipman John Byron, the surgeon, and about a dozen sailors. They were furious at what they saw as a mutiny, but they were also relieved. The constant tension of the past months, the arguments, the threat of violence, all that was gone. They could focus on survival. Cheap's plan remained the same: build some kind of vessel and sail north to the Spanish settlements. They had the wreck's cutter, a small boat that could carry about 15 men. With the men remaining, they could all fit, though it would be cramped and dangerous. They spent the next few weeks preparing. The carpenter who had stayed with them repaired the cutter as best he could. They gathered supplies, dried seal meat, shellfish, whatever they could scrounge. The indigenous Kaweskar occasionally visited, and Cheap tried to trade with them for food. These interactions were delicate. The Kaweskar were understandably wary, and Cheap's imperious manner didn't help. But gradually, a tentative relationship developed. By late December 1741, they were ready. They loaded the cutter and set out, rowing north through the channels. The journey was nightmarish from the start. The cutter was overloaded and wallowed in the seas. They had no accurate charts. The weather was typically foul: rain, wind, and cold. Within a week, they realized it was hopeless. They were making almost no progress, and the boat was taking on water. They turned back, defeated, and returned to Wager Island. This failure broke something in the group. The men who had remained with Cheap had done so partly out of loyalty, partly out of belief in his plan. Now that plan had failed, and they were back where they started, except that it was now the middle of the Antarctic summer, and they had consumed precious supplies for nothing. The group began to dissolve. Some of the sailors simply walked away, preferring to take their chances on their own. A few died. The surgeon, broken by months of failing to help the sick and injured, succumbed to despair and disease. By February 1742, Cheap's group was down to just 5 men: Cheap himself, 2 lieutenants, Midshipman Byron, and 1 loyal sailor. They were in desperate straits. Food was scarce, and they were too few to effectively hunt or gather. They were starving, and they knew that if they remained on Wager Island, they would die. In March 1742, they were rescued, though rescued is perhaps too generous a word. A group of Kaweskar found them near death and decided to help. The indigenous people fed them, nursed them to a semblance of health, and eventually guided them north in their bark canoes. It was an extraordinary act of mercy from a people who had little reason to show any kindness to Europeans. The Kaweskar brought them to a Spanish mission station at Chiloé, an island off the southern coast of Chile. The Spanish authorities there were astonished. A British naval captain and his men, more than a year after their ship had wrecked? It seemed impossible. But Cheap's uniform, though ragged, and his authoritative bearing, convinced them. The Spanish treated them as prisoners of war, but also with a certain respect. Cheap was, after all, a captain in the Royal Navy,
an officer, and a gentleman. They were housed, fed, and gradually regained their strength. Over the following year, they were moved from one Spanish settlement to another, slowly making their way north toward more populated areas of Chile and eventually Peru. It was during this time that Cheap learned what had become of Bulkeley and the Speedwell. Word reached the Spanish authorities that a group of British sailors had reached Brazil, claiming to have survived a shipwreck. Cheap was enraged. Bulkeley and his mutineers had not only defied his orders, but apparently survived, and would get back to England to tell their lies about what had happened. Cheap became obsessed with refuting Bulkeley's account. He spent hours dictating his version of events to anyone who would listen, insisting that he had been the victim of a mutiny, that Bulkeley was the villain, and that justice must be served. In 1744, through a prisoner exchange, Cheap and his companions were finally repatriated to England. They arrived to find Bulkeley's book had already been published and had become a bestseller. The public was fascinated by the story, but the prevailing sentiment was sympathetic to Bulkeley. He was portrayed as a hero who had saved his men from a tyrannical captain. Cheap was appalled. He immediately demanded a court-martial, not for himself, but for Bulkeley and the others, whom he wanted tried for mutiny. The Admiralty was in a delicate position.
The legal proceedings that followed the return of the Wager survivors became a landmark in British naval history. They raised fundamental questions about authority, duty, and the limits of obedience that would resonate for generations. The problem facing the Admiralty was this: both sides had plausible arguments. Cheap insisted that he had been the captain, his orders had been lawful, and the men who defied him were mutineers who should be hanged. Bulkeley countered that the wreck had ended Cheap's commission, that Cheap's subsequent behavior had been tyrannical and endangered everyone, and that they had been right to remove him from authority. The legal issue turned on a technical question. Was the crew of the Wager still subject to naval discipline after the ship was wrecked? The Articles of War, the regulations governing the Royal Navy, were clear about behavior aboard ship, but silent about what happened after a ship was lost. Was a wrecked ship still a ship for legal purposes? Did a captain's commission continue when there was no ship to command? There was no clear precedent. Shipwrecks had happened before, of course, but usually the survivors had stuck together under the captain's command until they were rescued or reached safety. The Wager case was unique because of the split, the conflicting claims of authority, and the fact that both groups had survived to tell their stories. The Admiralty decided to hold a series of courts-martial to sort out what had happened. These were not criminal trials in the ordinary sense. A court-martial in the Royal Navy was an administrative proceeding conducted by a panel of senior officers designed to investigate misconduct and determine whether regulations had been violated. The verdict could range from acquittal to dismissal from service to execution. The first court-martial in April 1746 was for Captain Cheap. He was charged with the loss of His Majesty's ship Wager, a standard charge whenever a ship was lost, regardless of fault. Cheap mounted a vigorous defense, arguing that the loss had been due to circumstances beyond his control: the storms, the navigational errors of his subordinates, the poor condition of the ship. He was acquitted. The court found that he had done everything that could reasonably be expected, and that the loss was not due to negligence or misconduct. This was a significant victory for Cheap. It established that he had been the legitimate captain of the Wager up until the moment of the wreck, and that his actions in trying to save the ship had been proper. But the more important question remained: what about afterward? What about the shooting of Cozens? What about the men who had defied him and sailed away? The court-martial of John Bulkeley and the other senior members of the Speedwell group took place later in 1746. They were charged with mutiny, desertion, and leaving their captain. It should have been an open and shut case for the prosecution. They had clearly defied the captain's orders and sailed away. Under the Articles of War, that was mutiny, and the penalty was death. But the defense presented a sophisticated argument.
They claimed that the wreck of the Wager had fundamentally altered the legal situation. Once the ship was lost, the crew reverted to being ordinary seamen, not subject to the stricter discipline of the Articles of War. They had a right, even a duty, to take actions to preserve their own lives. Cheap's plan to sail north into Spanish hands would have resulted in their imprisonment or death. Bulkeley's plan, while incredibly dangerous, at least gave them a chance to remain free men and return to England. Therefore, their actions were not mutiny, but rather self-preservation. The argument was clever, and it exploited a genuine gap in the naval regulations. The prosecutors struggled to refute it. They argued that discipline had to be maintained in all circumstances, or else chaos would result. If sailors could simply decide that their officers' orders were unreasonable and go their own way, the entire structure of naval authority would collapse. The court deliberated for several days. In the end, they reached a verdict that stunned everyone. Bulkeley and the others were acquitted. The court found that while their actions were highly irregular, they did not constitute mutiny under the strict legal definition. The wreck of the ship had created an ambiguous situation, and the men had acted reasonably to preserve their lives. Cheap's plan to return to England would have resulted in their imprisonment or death. Bulkeley's plan, while incredibly dangerous, at least gave them a chance to remain free men and return to England. Therefore, their actions were not mutiny, but rather self-preservation. The argument was clever, and it exploited a genuine gap in the naval regulations. The prosecutors struggled to refute it. They argued that discipline had to be maintained in all circumstances, or else chaos would result. If sailors could simply decide that their officers' orders were unreasonable and go their own way, the entire structure of naval authority would collapse. The court deliberated for several days. In the end, they reached a verdict that stunned everyone. Bulkeley and the others were acquitted. The court found that while their actions were highly irregular, they did not constitute mutiny under the strict legal definition. The wreck of the ship had created an ambiguous situation, and the men had acted reasonably to preserve their lives. Cheap's plan to return to England would have resulted in their imprisonment or death. Bulkeley's plan, while incredibly dangerous, at least gave them a chance to remain free men and return to England. Therefore, their actions were not mutiny, but rather self-preservation.
The acquittal of Bulkeley's group sent shockwaves through the Royal Navy. If sailors could defy their officers and be acquitted because they judged the officers' orders to be unwise, what would happen to discipline? The Admiralty moved quickly to close the legal loophole that the Wager case had exposed. In 1749, a new set of naval regulations was promulgated, which explicitly stated that naval discipline continued in full force even after a ship was lost, until such time as the crew was formally discharged or transferred. A captain retained his authority over his crew in all circumstances, whether aboard a ship, on a boat, or marooned on an island. Disobedience remained mutiny, regardless of the circumstances. The new regulations also addressed the issue of what happened when different groups of survivors went their separate ways. The captain's authority extended to all crew members unless they were formally released by the captain. Simply leaving without permission was desertion and mutiny, even if the crew genuinely believed it was necessary for survival. These changes became a permanent part of British naval law and influenced the naval codes of other countries as well. The Wager case became a cautionary tale taught to midshipmen and officers, the importance of maintaining discipline, the dangers of tyrannical behavior by officers, and the legal complexities that could arise in extreme situations. But the story didn't end with the courts-martial. The personal fates of the main characters reveal much about the values and structures of 18th century society. Captain David Cheap never received another command. The Admiralty, while officially acquitting him, clearly had doubts about his judgment and his ability to maintain the loyalty of his men. He was promoted to Rear Admiral in 1758, but this was largely an honorary rank, a pension more than an active position.
He lived quietly, bitterly resenting what he saw as the injustice done to him, until his death in 1752. John Bulkeley, the gunner who had led the Speedwell to safety, had a curious fate. Despite being acquitted, he was never promoted and never received the recognition he felt he deserved. Part of the problem was social. He was a warrant officer, not a commissioned officer, and the rigid class structure of the Navy meant there was a ceiling to how far he could rise. His book, while commercially successful, also marked him as a troublemaker. The Navy valued loyalty and obedience above independence of thought. Bulkeley left the service in the late 1740s and disappeared into obscurity. John Byron, the young midshipman who had remained loyal to Captain Cheap, had the most successful career of any of the Wager survivors. He returned to active service, commanded several ships, and eventually rose to the rank of vice admiral. He circumnavigated the globe in 1764 to 1766, exploring the Pacific and claiming the Falkland Islands for Britain. His experiences on Wager Island shaped him profoundly. He became known as an officer who treated his men fairly, who listened to his subordinates, and who understood that leadership was about more than simply issuing orders. His nickname in the Navy was Foul Weather Jack, because he seemed to encounter storms on every voyage, but he always brought his ships and men home safely. And then there's the strange coda involving his grandson, Lord George Byron, the Romantic poet. Byron the poet grew up hearing stories about his grandfather's adventures, and they clearly influenced his work. The themes of isolation, survival, rebellion against authority, and the contest between civilization and nature that run through his poetry echo the experiences of the Wager survivors. In some ways, the literary legacy of the Wager is as significant as its legal legacy.